John Wayne took Maureen O'Hara's hand across the desk, and in a voice considerably quieter than the one that had commanded movie screens for 4 decades, he told her that his doctors had given him 3 months to live. Several people present later described this exact moment as carrying a specific and unmistakable gravity from its very first second, John Wayne's entire physical bearing shifting into something considerably more vulnerable than anyone in that studio had ever previously witnessed from him. It was April 9th, 1979, and the studio audience of 300 people at NBC Studios in Burbank went completely silent within seconds. Several people present later saying they had never experienced anything like the specific stillness that followed those 7 words. Maureen O'Hara did not cry immediately. She simply held his hand tighter, and when she finally spoke, what she said made John Wayne, a man famous across his entire career for never once breaking down on camera, lower his head and weep openly in front of 26 million Americans who would watch the broadcast later that night. Coming up, exactly what Maureen O'Hara said in that exact moment, the real history of the friendship that made this confession possible, and why John Wayne chose this particular stage, with this particular woman, to say the words he had not yet said to almost anyone else in his life. But before we dive in, I see messages all the time in the comments section that some of you didn't realize you weren't subscribed. So if you could do me a favor and double-check if you're a subscriber to this channel, that would be tremendously appreciated. It's simple, it's free, and it's something anybody who watches this show frequently can do to help us keep everything going. Please do double-check if you've subscribed, and thank you so much, because in a strange way, you're part of our history, and you're on this journey with us, and I appreciate you for that. Now let's go back and understand exactly what brought these 2 people to that exact moment, because what happened on that stage did not come from nowhere. It came from 29 years of a friendship that neither Wayne nor O'Hara had ever fully explained to the American public. A friendship built across 5 films and a private bond that both of them, in their own separate and rare interviews over the decades, described as one of the most significant relationships of their entire lives. John Wayne and Maureen O'Hara first worked together in 1950 on Rio Grande, a film that neither of them anticipated would become the beginning of one of the most enduring on-screen and off-screen partnerships in the history of American cinema. Both performers arrived to that first production as already established figures within the industry, though neither carried any particular expectation that this specific collaboration would ultimately prove more significant or more lasting than any of their numerous other professional partnerships across their considerable individual careers. Their chemistry was immediate and, according to director John Ford, who worked with both of them repeatedly across the following decades, entirely unforced, a specific and genuine ease between 2 performers that translated directly onto film in ways that considerably more calculated pairings rarely achieved. Ford himself, notoriously demanding and notoriously difficult to satisfy across his own extensive directorial career, reportedly told colleagues that he had rarely witnessed 2 performers develop genuine off-screen rapport as quickly or as completely as Wayne and O'Hara did during their earliest scenes together, a specific chemistry that convinced him almost immediately that he had found a pairing worth returning to across multiple future productions. The 2 went on to make 5 films together across the following 2 decades, including 1952's The Quiet Man, widely considered one of the finest films either performer ever appeared in, a production during which their off-screen friendship deepened considerably amid the demanding conditions of filming on location in rural Ireland. The production of The Quiet Man required a lengthy and considerably demanding location shoot in County Mayo, Ireland, weeks of filming under genuinely difficult conditions that included unpredictable weather and the specific logistical complications of working far from the established studio infrastructure both performers had grown accustomed to across their earlier careers. According to several crew members present, this shared hardship produced a specific and considerable bonding experience between Wayne and O'Hara, the two performers spending considerable time together during breaks in filming, developing a private shorthand and a private ease that carried forward into every subsequent collaboration across the following 2 decades. What almost nobody in the general American public fully understood was the specific depth of the private friendship that developed between Wayne and O'Hara across these decades, a friendship that both of them, according to people who knew them well, considered genuinely unlike any other relationship in either of their lives. A specific closeness rooted in mutual respect, shared professional standards, and a particular kind of honesty that both performers found difficult to access with almost anyone else in an industry not always known for genuine candor. O'Hara herself, in one of her own rare later interviews, described Wayne as the finest man she had ever known, a description she repeated consistently across the following decades without ever fully elaborating on the specific private experiences that had led her to that particular conviction. The specific consistency of this description deserves fuller understanding, because it illustrates exactly how genuinely and how deeply O'Hara held this conviction across the entire remainder of her own long life. She repeated some version of this exact sentiment in interviews conducted across 5 separate decades, from the years immediately following their earliest collaborations through her own final public appearances many years after Wayne's death, a specific consistency that friends and biographers alike noted as unusual even for a friendship as genuinely significant as theirs clearly was. She rarely offered specific anecdotes to support this characterization, according to people who interviewed her across the years, instead simply restating her conviction with the same quiet certainty each time, as though the truth of it required no further elaboration or justification. Quick reminder before we continue, because this next part of the story matters enormously. If you're enjoying this so far, take just a second to hit that like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect moment, because what you are about to learn about the final months of John Wayne's life reveals a side of him almost nobody in America ever saw. John Wayne's health had been a source of private and considerable concern for years before this broadcast. He had undergone surgery in 1964 to remove a cancerous lung and 2 ribs, a procedure that he characteristically and publicly downplayed at the time, referring to his recovery in terms that suggested the matter was fully behind him. The specific severity of this original 1964 diagnosis deserves fuller documentation, because it illuminates exactly how significant Wayne's public composure during his recovery actually was. His doctors had discovered the cancer at a relatively advanced stage, requiring the removal of his entire left lung, along with 2 ribs, an extensive surgical procedure that left him with permanently reduced lung capacity for the remainder of his life. Wayne's own public statements about this surgery, delivered with characteristic understatement, described the experience in considerably less dramatic terms than the medical reality actually warranted, a specific pattern of stoic public minimization that would eventually characterize his handling of his final diagnosis 15 years later as well. For nearly 15 years following that surgery, Wayne appeared to have genuinely beaten the disease, continuing to make films and maintain the same demanding physical presence that had defined his entire career. In January of 1979, however, Wayne began experiencing symptoms that his doctors initially struggled to fully explain: persistent digestive discomfort that gradually intensified over the following weeks. Further testing, conducted in the early months of 1979, revealed a considerably more serious diagnosis: stomach cancer that had, by the time it was discovered, already progressed to an advanced stage. The specific circumstances of this diagnosis carried a particular and considerable cruelty that Wayne himself reportedly acknowledged privately to close family members, a stomach cancer entirely unrelated to the earlier lung cancer he had successfully survived 15 years prior, meaning that his own considerable earlier victory over the disease had done nothing to protect him from this new and unrelated diagnosis. Medical specialists who reviewed his case at the time reportedly noted the specific difficulty of detecting stomach cancer in its earlier and more treatable stages, given how easily its initial symptoms could be mistaken for considerably more benign digestive complaints, a diagnostic challenge that meant Wayne's cancer had already progressed significantly by the time doctors finally identified its actual nature. Wayne's doctors, according to an account eventually confirmed by a member of his own family, gave him a specific and sobering prognosis in March of 1979, estimating that he had approximately 3 months remaining. Wayne told very few people about this diagnosis in the weeks immediately following, according to people close to him during this period, choosing to process the news privately while continuing, wherever possible, to maintain his usual public schedule and his usual public composure. The specific list of people Wayne chose to inform during these earliest weeks deserves fuller documentation, because it illustrates exactly how carefully and how deliberately he managed the disclosure of this devastating news. He told his immediate family first, according to accounts given by his children in later years, followed by a small handful of the colleagues and friends he considered genuinely essential to inform directly, rather than allow to learn second-hand through the considerable rumor and speculation that inevitably surrounded any prominent figure's declining health. This careful and deliberate approach to disclosure reflected, according to people who observed it directly, Wayne's own considerable concern about maintaining some measure of genuine privacy and genuine dignity during what he understood, even in these earliest weeks, would likely become an increasingly public and increasingly scrutinized final chapter of his life. He specifically avoided telling several close professional colleagues, according to this same account, understanding that public knowledge of his condition would transform every subsequent public appearance into something considerably more complicated than the ordinary professional obligations he still hoped to fulfill during whatever time remained to him. Maureen O'Hara, according to her own later account, learned about Wayne's diagnosis directly from him, in a private telephone call he made specifically to tell her before the information reached her through any other channel, a decision that O'Hara said she understood, even in the moment of receiving that devastating call, as a specific and considerable honor, given how selectively Wayne had chosen to share this particular truth. O'Hara described this specific telephone call in considerable detail in one of her own later interviews, recalling the particular quality of Wayne's voice during the conversation, steady and deliberately controlled even as he delivered news that she understood, even in that first devastating moment, would fundamentally alter the remainder of both of their lives. She said that Wayne had specifically thanked her, near the conclusion of that call, for the particular kind of friendship that had allowed him to say something this difficult directly and honestly, without needing to manage her reaction or soften the truth in the way he apparently felt compelled to do with several other people in his life. She described spending the following days in a private grief she felt largely unable to share with anyone else who might have understood the specific and considerable weight of what she had just learned. This particular isolation, according to O'Hara's own later reflection, represented one of the more genuinely difficult aspects of the entire experience, carrying knowledge of this magnitude while continuing to navigate her own ordinary professional and personal obligations, unable to discuss the specific source of her private grief with colleagues and friends who had no reason to suspect anything was genuinely wrong. She described specific moments during these weeks when she found herself nearly overwhelmed by the weight of this private knowledge, moments she navigated largely alone, understanding that Wayne's own careful and deliberate management of who knew what represented a trust she was determined not to violate, regardless of her own considerable private difficulty carrying it. Johnny Carson had booked both John Wayne and Maureen O'Hara for the same broadcast to discuss their considerable shared filmography, an appearance built around warm nostalgic reflection on one of American cinema's most beloved on-screen partnerships. Carson himself had genuine personal admiration for both performers, having interviewed each of them separately on numerous previous occasions across his own extensive tenure hosting the program, and he considered this particular joint appearance a genuinely significant opportunity to explore with two of the actual participants the considerable cultural legacy of their 5 shared films. Johnny Carson had booked both John Wayne and Maureen O'Hara for the same broadcast to discuss their considerable shared filmography, an appearance built around warm nostalgic reflection on one of American cinema's most beloved on-screen partnerships. Nobody on the production staff had any indication of Wayne's actual diagnosis, understanding this appearance simply as a well-timed reunion between two respected performers with a long and celebrated history together. The production team had in fact been trying to arrange exactly this kind of joint appearance for several years, understanding the considerable audience appeal of reuniting two performers whose combined filmography represented some of the most beloved films in American cinema history. And they had no reason whatsoever to suspect that this particular scheduling success carried any significance beyond its obvious entertainment value. The taping began exactly as anticipated, Wayne and O'Hara trading warm and genuinely affectionate stories about their decades of collaboration, the studio audience delighting in chemistry that had clearly not diminished at all since their most recent film together. Nothing in these opening minutes suggested any indication of the profound and unscripted confession that would soon transform the entire tenor of the broadcast. Roughly 11 minutes into the conversation, Johnny Carson, with entirely innocent curiosity, asked Wayne a broad question about his upcoming projects, wondering aloud what audiences might expect from him next. This particular question emerged naturally from the broader conversation's earlier drift toward Wayne's continuing career plans, a topic Carson had raised with genuine and entirely ordinary professional curiosity, rather than any specific anticipation of the profound revelation it would soon unexpectedly produce. Do not miss what happens next, because it is the moment this entire story has been building toward. John Wayne was quiet for a long moment, and several people present described a specific and unmistakable shift in his characteristically confident bearing, something considerably more vulnerable beginning to surface. He said that he needed to say something he had not yet said publicly, and he turned, deliberately, away from Carson and toward Maureen O'Hara beside him. This specific and deliberate physical reorientation, several people present later noted, carried its own quiet significance, Wayne choosing, in this critical moment, to address his closest friend directly, rather than simply speaking outward toward the host or the broader audience. A small but genuinely telling gesture that revealed exactly who he considered the actual recipient of what he was about to say. He took her hand across the desk, and in a voice considerably quieter than the one that had commanded movie screens for 4 decades, he told her, and the entire watching studio, that his doctors had given him 3 months to live. The studio audience went completely silent within seconds. Maureen O'Hara did not cry immediately. She simply held his hand tighter. Her own composure developed across an equally long and equally demanding career, holding steady through what several people present described as sheer force of will. Her own considerable training across decades of demanding film performances, several colleagues later noted, gave her a specific and rare capacity to remain outwardly composed even while experiencing genuine and overwhelming private emotion, a skill that served her, and by extension Wayne himself, exactly when it mattered most. When she finally spoke, her voice carrying a specific and deliberate steadiness, she told him that she had known, that he had told her privately weeks earlier, and that she had been waiting every single day since that phone call for him to find whatever moment felt right to finally say it publicly. She described, in this exact moment, having rehearsed countless private versions of how she might eventually respond once he finally chose to share the truth publicly, none of which, she later admitted, had adequately prepared her for the actual emotional weight of the moment once it genuinely arrived. She told him something else, something that made John Wayne, a man famous across his entire extensive career for never once breaking down in public, lower his head and weep openly. Several people present described this specific and remarkable transformation as one of the most genuinely startling moments any of them had ever witnessed on that particular stage. A man whose entire public persona had been built across 5 decades of American cinema around unshakable stoicism and unwavering physical composure, suddenly and completely overcome by emotion in front of the cameras. The specific silence that followed carried, according to several audience members, a quality distinct from ordinary shock, something closer to a collective and genuinely reverent recognition that they were witnessing something no rehearsal or careful preparation could have produced. She told him that in 29 years of friendship, across 5 films and countless private conversations, she had never once seen him afraid, and that watching him find the courage to say this difficult truth out loud in front of an audience was the single bravest thing she had ever personally witnessed him do. Considerably braver, she said, than anything he had ever performed on any film set across his entire legendary career. Johnny Carson, watching this unfold from behind his own desk, made no attempt to redirect the conversation or manage the broadcast back toward its planned structure. His own considerable experience managing countless unexpected moments across his extensive hosting career gave him, in this exact instance, the specific and correct instinct to simply become a witness rather than continuing to actively direct a conversation that had, within seconds, become considerably more significant than anything his production team could have originally planned for that particular evening. The studio audience, 300 people who had arrived expecting warm, nostalgic reminiscence, sat in a silence that several people present described as the most complete and most genuinely devastating silence they ever experienced at a live taping, watching one of American cinema's most beloved and most stoic legends finally, publicly, confront his own mortality alongside the woman who understood him more completely than almost anyone else alive. Several audience members, interviewed by entertainment reporters in the days following the broadcast, described the specific and unusual privilege of witnessing this particular moment, several noting that they had grown up watching Wayne's films for their entire lives, giving them a specific and personal sense of loss even before his actual death occurred 2 months later. One audience member specifically told a reporter that watching Wayne, an icon whose entire public identity was built around unshakable strength, allow himself this exact moment of genuine and complete vulnerability, felt like witnessing something considerably more significant than ordinary celebrity interview content, a genuine and unrepeatable act of courage from a man who had spent 5 decades convincing American audiences that courage meant never showing fear at all. What followed was a considerably longer and more candid conversation than anyone had anticipated, Wayne and O'Hara discussing, with an openness neither had ever displayed so completely in any previous public appearance, the specific texture of their decades-long friendship, and the particular grace of finally being able to speak difficult truths directly, rather than continuing to manage them privately and alone. Wayne spoke, in particular, about the specific and considerable relief he felt having finally said the truth aloud in front of witnesses, describing the preceding weeks of careful, managed disclosure as exhausting in ways he had not fully anticipated when he first began selectively informing the small circle of people he trusted with the news. He said that maintaining the specific boundary between who knew and who did not had required a level of constant vigilance that had become, over time, considerably more draining than simply confronting the diagnosis itself, and that finally releasing that particular burden, in front of an audience large enough that he could no longer manage or control its spread, produced a specific and unexpected sense of genuine freedom alongside the obvious grief. NBC's switchboard received an overwhelming volume of calls in the days following the broadcast, viewers writing specifically to describe how deeply moved they had been watching two legends demonstrate what genuine friendship actually looked like when it mattered most. Several of these callers specifically described their own experiences facing serious illness or supporting a loved one through a difficult diagnosis, describing a particular resonance in watching Wayne finally allow himself the specific vulnerability of public grief after a public career defined so completely by stoic composure. One caller, a man recently diagnosed with a serious illness of his own, told a production staff member that watching Wayne find the courage to weep openly after decades of never once doing so on camera, gave him a specific and considerable permission to stop performing strength for the people around him and simply allow himself to feel the genuine fear his own diagnosis had produced. This response echoed across the substantial volume of calls and letters NBC received in the following weeks, suggested that what had happened on that stage had touched something considerably larger than the specific story of one legendary actor's final months. A broader recognition among American viewers about the genuine courage required to abandon performed strength in favor of authentic vulnerability. John Wayne died on June 11, 1979, just over 2 months after that broadcast, roughly matching the timeline his doctors had originally given him. In the 2 months between that broadcast and his death, according to accounts given by his family, Wayne continued to receive visits from a small and carefully managed circle of close friends and family, spending considerable time reflecting on his own extensive career and his own considerable legacy with a clarity and a directness that several visitors specifically noted as different from the more guarded and more careful public persona he had maintained across most of his professional life. He reportedly referenced the Tonight Show broadcast on multiple occasions during these final weeks, describing it, according to one family member's later recollection, as one of the genuinely important things he had managed to do before running out of time, a specific and deliberate act of honesty that he said had made everything that followed, including his own approaching death, considerably easier to face directly. Maureen O'Hara attended his funeral and spoke at length in the years that followed about their friendship and about that particular broadcast, describing it, in one later interview, as one of the most significant moments of her entire life. The specific privilege of being the person Wayne chose to trust with his own fear before he was ready to share it with the wider world. O'Hara's later reflections on the broadcast deserve fuller documentation because they illustrate exactly how significantly that single evening shaped her own subsequent understanding of their entire decades-long friendship. She said, in one particularly candid interview conducted several years after Wayne's death, that she had spent considerable time in the years following the broadcast reflecting on why Wayne had specifically chosen her, out of everyone in his life, to be the person he first confided in, and later, publicly, the person beside him, when he finally shared the truth with the wider world. She concluded, in her own words, that their friendship had always operated according to a specific and mutual understanding that neither of them ever needed to perform strength or composure for the other, an understanding built gradually across 5 films and 29 years that had ultimately made Wayne's most difficult confession possible in exactly the setting and exactly the company where it finally occurred. She died on October 24, 2015, 36 years after Wayne's death, and her own obituaries specifically referenced their legendary friendship as one of the most enduring and most genuine partnerships in the history of American film. Several of these obituaries specifically cited the 1979 Tonight Show broadcast as one of the defining moments of her entire public legacy. Evidence. Several film historians noted that O'Hara's own considerable and celebrated career, spanning decades of significant film roles, was in some respects permanently and inextricably connected to that single evening of profound honesty alongside her closest friend. One historian, examining the broader cultural legacy of both performers' careers, noted that the broadcast had become, over the following decades, one of the most frequently referenced examples available of what genuine and unguarded friendship actually looked like among two of Hollywood's most enduringly beloved performers. A specific and lasting testament to 29 years of a bond that both Wayne and O'Hara had spent their careers building, largely privately, long before the wider world ever had the opportunity to witness its full and considerable depth. There is one final detail about this story that deserves to be understood, something that connects the entire arc of Wayne and O'Hara's remarkable 29-year friendship back to what happened on that Tonight Show stage, years after both performers had passed away. When film historians and biographers began examining the full scope of their extraordinary shared filmography and their extraordinary shared friendship for various retrospective projects, several specifically identified this particular broadcast as one of the most genuinely significant and most emotionally revealing moments in the entire history of American television, a rare and unrepeatable instance of one of the country's most enduring symbols of stoic masculine strength, allowing himself, in front of millions of witnesses, to be completely and genuinely human. This moment, several historians noted, ultimately became inseparable from the broader legacy both performers left behind, evidence that the most enduring and most genuine friendships are frequently defined not by grand professional achievement, but by the specific willingness to be truthful and vulnerable with each other when it matters most. If this story moved you tonight, I want you to think about the difficult truths you might be carrying privately, and about the specific person in your life who could help you finally find the courage to say them out loud. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that even the toughest, most stoic people you know are often waiting for the right person to finally help them tell the truth. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories about the friendships that gave America's most legendary performers the courage to be genuinely honest. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from, and telling me about the person in your own life who has helped you say the things you were most afraid to say. That specific kind of trust, built patiently over years rather than discovered overnight, is often the truest measure of what genuine friendship actually means.